Oh.
Okay, we are live.
Are we okay?
Yes, yes.
Boa tarde, pessoal. É com grande prazer e honra que estamos recebendo hoje nosso convidado, Dr. Stuart Pimm. Farei sua apresentação em inglês e a palestra dele também será em inglês, embora as perguntas possam ser feitas tanto em inglês quanto em português. E nós ajudaremos com a tradução, se for necessário. Então, nosso programa de pós-graduação agradece muito a presença do Stuart e a presença da audiência. Good afternoon, Stuart. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to have you presenting a talk to us today. Dr. Stuart Pimm, Professor of Conservation at Duke University, is an internationally recognized global leader in the study of biodiversity, especially present-day extinctions and what the world can do to prevent them. His message that we can all make a difference in our planet's survival inspires a wide audience. Pimm works in the forests of Colombia, Ecuador, and Brazil, and the savannas of Africa. In the last decade, he has been active in training Chinese conservation professionals and spends a month each year in China. Pimm directs Saving Nature, www.savingnature.org, a non-profit that uses donations for carbon emissions offsets to fund conservation groups in areas of exceptional tropical biodiversity to restore their degraded lands, including Brazil. Pimm is the author of over 350 scientific papers and 5 books, including the highly acclaimed assessment of the human impact to the planet, the world according to Pimm, a scientist audits the Earth. Pimm was awarded the 2019 International Cosmos Prize, one of the most prestigious honors presented in the environmental field. It recognizes groundbreaking research on the endangered species and his work at Saving Nature to promote practical approaches to reverse species declines by protecting and restoring their shrinking habitats. His international honors also included the Taylor Prize for Environmental Achievement in 2010 and the Dr. A.H. Heineken Prize for Environmental Sciences from the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2006. In addition to his remarkable and successful scientific career, he is an incredible gourmet. He cooks wonderfully and knows how to pair wine with food perfectly. Stuart and I are great friends, and we started collaborating in 1996, a year after I took my position at WERJ. We strengthened our collaboration when I spent 6 months at Duke University in 2002. And then we decided to make an incredible expedition funded by National Geographic Society on the mountains of Rio de Janeiro state in search of a rare, endangered, and endemic bird from the Atlantic forest in Rio de Janeiro state, the Pauga Escondida. We survived that, and here we are. With you, Professor Pimm.
Thank you. I hope you can see this. You talked about my book, World According to Pimm. I hope you can see my screen because the translation of it into Brazilian Portuguese, Terras de Terra, this is really a lovely book. I hope it's still available in Brazil. But I'm enormously proud that that my book was translated by a Brazilian colleague. So here we are. Thank you so much for listening to me today. I'm going to talk about the 30% solution. This is a set of plans that leaders around the world are promoting to be the next generation of plans to save biodiversity. And I'd like to talk about what this means internationally, but I also want to talk about what it means for Brazil. So in 2020, it's not going to be 2021, it's now going to be the spring of 2022. The UN Convention on Biodiversity is going to meet in Kunming in China. And they're going to come up with a set of plans that deal with, what the various nations of the world should achieve to protect biodiversity. It's called COP, the Convention of the Parties, and this will be the 15th meeting. So what are its aspirations? What did it hope to achieve in the past? How are we doing at meeting biodiversity targets, and how can we do better? So if you look at what the United States is trying to do, it's trying to set aside 30% of land and water by 2030. That's why we call it the 30-30 criteria. If you look at China, which is going to be the host, what they're trying to do is seemingly more complicated. But in fact, if you look at what the Chinese are proposing to do, they too are proposing to protect about 30% of their land in one way or another. They have about 18% of the land already protected. And they have what they call red lines, which are designations that limit the environmental destruction. So one way or another, the Chinese, as the hosts of the summit, have bought into this 30-30 idea. We in Britain have also committed to protecting 30% of the land. I want to talk a little bit about Britain. I'm not going to talk about China because I really don't have time. But we've got the US, we've got China, we've got Britain, all committing to set aside much greater areas for protection than we have so far. Now, is 30% enough? Is it sufficient? And the answer, quite clearly for Brazil, is that it's not anywhere near enough for the Amazon. If we only protect the Amazon, there is going to be a massive environmental shift. And a good paper on that is by Tom Lovejoy and Carlos Nobre in Science 3 years ago, which talks about the impact of Amazon deforestation and what that will do if it gets beyond a critical point. Now, I am a critic of global tipping points. I don't think there's evidence for global tipping points, but there's clearly good evidence that unless we protect 80 or 90% of the Amazon, there are going to be sort of massive environmental shifts. This is sort of beyond the area of my immediate interest because it's not specifically biodiversity. But I think we do understand that Brazil has an enormous challenge in not only protecting 30%, but protecting much more. So what did the Convention on Biodiversity try to achieve in the past? What were its previous targets? Well, over a decade ago, they came up with what were called the HE biodiversity targets. And there were several of these. But the key one was to protect 17% of the land surface and 10% of the oceans, and also to reduce the number of threatened species. So if we look at what people have been suggesting for the future, there's the 2010 targets of protecting 17%. We've currently protected only about 13% of the ice-free land surface. My very good friend, Ed Wilson, shown here with me, wants to protect half of the Earth. So there's a lot of different ideas out there that people are talking about in terms of what we can do for the future. So how well have we done in protecting biodiversity to date? I've just said that we've protected only perhaps 13% of the ice-free land surface. So what are we doing? How well have we achieved biodiversity protection? Well, let's talk a little bit about what we know about biodiversity. 2 years ago, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services came out with a report on the current extinction crisis. Now, I'm very pleased to report that IPBES, the group, didn't mention the sixth extinction. I think the sixth extinction is a term that's terribly misleading. It isn't really very helpful. It's something that the media like, but it doesn't really tell us what's going on. What this report claims is that there are about 8 million species, and 1 million of them are threatened with extinction. The problem with those numbers is, frankly, we do not have a really good idea about how many species there are. This 8 million is just one estimate. It's a very controversial estimate. And I don't think it's a good idea to place so much on a number that's so incredibly uncertain. It then says, well, about 1/8 of those species are threatened. That's absolutely a guess. But what it does say is how much faster species are going extinct now and in the past. And that is something that we can estimate with very, very much more certainty. Obviously, I'm saying that because this happens to be my work. So let's talk about it. So when former US Vice President Al Gore wrote in his book, An Inconvenient Truth, that there's a mass extinction crisis with this extinction rate 1,000 times higher than the expected rate. He, in fact, is quoting my work done with Gareth Russell and John Gittleman, Tom Brooks, who's now the chief scientist at IUCN. So 25 years ago, we came up with this number that the extinction rate is 1,000 times higher. Now, I was happy to be quoted by Al Gore, but I have to tell you, I'm even more happy to be quoted by this lady who is holding up a poster in a street demonstration in London, I believe, talking about the extinction rate. So, my work has been very well cited. Al Gore has quoted it. but I've never had my work held up in a street demonstration before. So the reason why I prefer this number and why Al Gore uses this number, why Sapatha Dasgupta uses this number in a report he has done on the economics of biodiversity loss to the British government, is that we really don't know how many species there are. With Bill Lawrence, who's worked extensively in the Amazon, Lucas Chopper, a former PhD student of mine, Brett Sheffers, we looked at all the different estimates of how many species there are, and the numbers vary all over the place. We really don't know. I want to just sort of interrupt myself for a moment. I notice there's a chat box. If you type something in the chat box, I don't see it. All I see is that there's something in the chat box. So if you want to ask me a question, you'll have to ask Mary Elise to ask me the question.
Sorry, Stuart,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Yes, you're gonna collect all these questions in the Zoom for you to discuss with you after your talk.
Perfect.
And we also will collect the questions made in the YouTube, and we'll do the same. Don't worry.
Super. Thank you so much. It's one of the annoying features of Zoom is you can't see what people are asking you. So we don't really know the number of species very well. And that's why I think it's important to talk about this as a death rate, a rate at which species are going extinct. And that is something we can estimate quite well. So an extinction rate is a death rate. And we can talk about death rates for people. Globally, about 8,000 people per million people die each year. That's the sort of the global average death rate. So many deaths per million people per year. During COVID, that number has been substantially higher in the US. Like Brazil, we have had leadership which has not properly understood how devastating this disease can be. So we can compare death rates. We can compare how many people usually die in a year in the US and how many people are dying over the last year. Well, extinction is a death rate for species rather than individuals. And we can calculate those death rates by looking at sets of species over periods of time and looking at what fraction of those species have died out. And so for the nearly 9,000 species of birds that were known before 1900, 93 of those species became extinct after 1900, in the 100 years or so after 1900. And that number of species going extinct in that period of time enables us to calculate an extinction rate. And it's 51 extinctions per million species per year. We can do that for amphibians and we can do it for mammals. What we can also do is to calculate the same death rate for species that were discovered after 1900. For birds, 1,230 species have been described by taxonomists since 1900. And the extinction rate for those much more recently described species is considerably higher. If we look at amphibians, the difference between species described earlier and species described after 1900 is striking. There's a lot of new species of amphibians. Frege and Nena are describing them vigorously. There's a lot of very new species of amphibians coming out of the Mata Atlântica in Brazil. It's an area of very rich amphibian biodiversity. Many of those species have tiny geographical ranges. And we see consistently that species described more recently have higher extinction rates. And that's because the species that we discover recently are species that are rare. We know for Brazil, for example, that there have been several species of birds from the Mata Atlântica that were described after they had gone extinct, because people didn't realize what they were, and it was only after they went extinct that they realized that they were distinct species. So to come up with sort of a synopsis of this, we know that somewhere between 50 and 500 extinctions per million species years is the typical death rate of species at the present time. And that species that are described more recently have higher extinction rates because they are rarer and they are more vulnerable. They're rarer, that's why they were only discovered recently. Now, what is the background rate of extinction? This is a remarkably difficult number to get a hold of. I worked on this with Yuri de Vos to look at what the different estimates were. There's the fossil record. The fossil record is sort of an obvious way of looking at natural extinction rates, but it's problematical because the fossil record is not very good. What paleontologists mean by species are usually genera. The species we know best are, marine bivalves and gastropods, and the fossil record is not very well resolved. So it only gives you a very rough idea. What we have an enormous amount of information on is the rate in which species diversify. There are thousands and thousands of studies where people reconstruct molecular phylogenies. And this is an example of one. It's a group of orchids from South Africa. And you can see the rate at which those orchids diversify from the basis of molecular phylogenies. And for this particular group of species, which diversify actually really quite rapidly, what we get is a birth rate. We get 0.26 new species per million species years. And so we can compare that with the death rate, which is how fast species are going extinct. And the conclusion to this is that species are dying out at, earlier I said 50 to 500, but let's say 100 to 1,000 extinctions per million species years. And that's 1,000 times faster than species are diversifying as judged by their molecular phylogenies. So this is a measurable statistic for our impact on biodiversity. We can do this now for birds, mammals, amphibians, for reptiles, for some fish, for plants. We're beginning to get an increasing catalog of the rate at which a species are going extinct. So the question now is, how well are we doing at protecting species? Well, my colleagues and I, including Clinton Jenkins, formerly of IPE, wanted to look at whether we've done as good a job at protecting biodiversity as we could. And we wanted to talk about where biodiversity is being protected. The areas shown in green are the world's protected areas, including areas that are set aside for indigenous peoples in the Amazon. The area shown in yellow is the half of the Earth that has the least human impact. We simply divided the Earth as best we could into two equal halves, the half with less human impact, the half with more human impact. And as you can see from this Venn diagram at the left, protected areas are mostly in the areas that have less human impact. We put protected areas where there are no people. And the reason we did this is that when you start saying, well, we want to protect 17% of the planet, or 30% of the planet, or 50% of the planet, if you're just going to protect areas where there are no people, is that going to be good for biodiversity? So the question is, have we allocated our protected areas in places that are good for species? And if we continue to protect more of these wild places, these places with few people, will that benefit biodiversity? Well, this area is, I believe, the largest national park in the world. And that photograph is mine. I took it out of the window on a plane, traveling from the United States to China. When you fly from the US to China, you fly right over the pole, and you fly right over northern Greenland. And so there is the largest national park.
Sure. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but there is a sign here that the battery of your Mac is going to finish. So can you?
Really?
Plug it, please.
Oh, why is it not? That's very alarming because I am plugged in. Let me see if that's going to work. Oh, heaven's sakes. Has that gone away now? I think it has.
It's okay. I think we keep going.
Yeah, I had it plugged in somewhere and it obviously wasn't plugged in properly.
Okay.
So thank you for reminding me, because I couldn't see that. So, you know, this is a big national park, but it isn't particularly good for biodiversity. There are some species up there. But you know, protecting big places with no species doesn't do a lot for biodiversity. So I want to talk about the null hypothesis. Supposing we put protected areas down at random. There's 17.9% million square kilometers that are protected. There's, as best we can, two halves of areas with the most human impact and the less human impact. So we have 13% protected and 15% wilderness. What happens to biodiversity protection? What's the null hypothesis? Well, supposing we have a a species with a large geographical range. And we put this species down at random. Well, we'd expect 13% of its range to be protected and 15% of its range to be wilderness. What happens if we look at this species with a tiny geographical range, supposing there are 6 species of unicorns? We haven't discovered them yet because they have tiny geographical ranges. Well, we'd expect 13% of the species to be protected and 50% of the species to be in wilderness. So it doesn't matter whether you look at large range species or small range species, you'd expect to see these numbers coming up. So if you do that for birds and mammals and amphibians around the world, what we see is that, as expected, approximately 13% of all large range species have their ranges protected, and close to 50% of those ranges are protected by, relatively protected by being in wild areas, areas where there are few people. So this sort of has to be that way. Species with big ranges are going to look like 13% protected. What happens when we look at species with small geographical ranges? Well, the remarkable thing is that for species with small geographical ranges, we have done considerably better at protecting their ranges. So you'd expect somewhere between 25% and 50% of the ranges of species with the smallest geographical ranges are protected by our protected areas. In other words, we put our protected areas in the right places. What this also shows is that protecting more wild areas, protecting a lot more of the places where there are few people, wouldn't do a great deal to improve that. So when you ask for 30% or 50%, unless you put those protected areas in the right places, it's not going to do a lot for biodiversity. So, overall, we've done a sort of a better job at protecting species than many people believe. We've done a sensible job in allocating where our protected areas should be. And going into the COP15 meeting in China next year, we want more of the good stuff that we're doing, not just area for the sake of it. So how does this, how do Ed Wilson and I, do we agree on this? And so, I argued with Ed that we can't just put all our priorities on protecting areas with few people in them, and that asking for half Earth or 30% of Earth needs to be done in a way that's sensible. And Ed replied, he said, look, I think this half Earth idea is a great idea. It's capturing a lot of support, but we need a prioritized half Earth. We need to have a prioritized 30% so that we're putting our protected areas in the right places. So how can we do better? Well, it's often going to be hard. This is a protected area. This is Britain's first national park. It's called the Peak District. This particular place is extraordinarily personal and special to me. That bridge on the right is where my mother and my father first met on a date. And it's where a few years ago I scattered my parents' ashes when they died. While it looks to be a lovely place, a lot of this area is not native vegetation. There's a lot of invasive trees that have been planted, and the upland areas are being stripped of their natural vegetation. So for Britain, just protecting wild areas isn't going to do anything to protect the natural biodiversity. If we look at the United States, we have an amazing problem in that if you look at where Britain's endemic species are, where America's endemic species are, they are predominantly in the southeastern United States. And we've got data on mammals and birds and amphibians and reptiles, fish and trees. The southeastern United States is important. But the biggest conservation group in the United States is called the Nature Conservancy. And it completely neglects the southeastern United States. And moreover, it encourages logging in the United States for wood chips, which does an enormous amount of harm. And the problem, quite simply, is if you look at where the Nature Conservancy is putting its reserves, they're shown in these blue dots. They're not in the places where the greatest numbers of species are. They're up in the Northeast. They're putting their reserves where the money is. They're putting the reserves where rich people are and not where species are. In fact, this is sort of makes that point. If you look at where those reserves are and you look at where the wealthy people are in the United States, they're putting the reserves where wealthy people are. So wealthy people want to have a tiny little reserve around their home to prevent other people from living next to them. If you look at where the poor people are in the United States, and these areas of Appalachia are poorer than probably the state of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. These are very, very poor areas indeed. You see that these areas where there's an incredibly high poverty rate, where there's a great deal of industrial mining, these are the areas that are important for species. So we in the US are not doing a terribly good job of protecting our biodiversity. So let's talk about what I do saving nature. And I'm going to now click and a movie should appear. And if for any reason it doesn't appear and you don't hear the sound, you better let me know. We can map out the distribution of many species now in considerable detail. These are birds, and they show that the warm, wet tropics are where most of the species are. Mammals show a broadly similar pattern. These are the places with the greatest concentration of species, and it's likely to be true for most species. Amphibians, for example, show a similar pattern, and while we have less detailed data for plants, it's almost certainly true for plants too. So let's take a look at where the concept, I don't know why that video ended when it did. I'm sorry, it ended too quickly, but let me move on anyway. We can map out not just where species are, but where threatened species are. And let's do that for Brazil. Everybody understands that the Amazon basin has a huge number of species in it. But if you look at where species with small geographical ranges are concentrated, it's in the Mata Atlântica, and in particular, it's in the state of Rio de Janeiro. The coastal forests are the places where the greatest number of threatened species occur in Brazil. And so we can map out areas and we can look at areas which correspond, of course, to the late Norman Meyer's definition of hotspots. that coastal Brazil has the greatest number of threatened species within the Americas. If we look at this region, it's clear why, in addition to having a lot of species with small ranges, it's lost most of its forest. And if we zoom in on the area where you are, and we look at the forest cover in detail, what we've done on this map is to enhance the color of the forest. If you look at that image, you'll see there's a lot of forest in small pieces. We can take out those small pieces. What I'm doing in this comparison is taking out all the forest that's less than 100 hectares. And about 15% of the forest of this area is in fragments that are smaller than 100 hectares. So there's even less forest here than you might think. And this is a photograph that I took with Maria Elise many years ago from a helicopter, flying over the forest to the east of where you are now. And you can see the situation. There is a lot of forest in small fragments. Working with Clinton, we have mapped out where the species are and color-coded it, first of all, by forest. If it's colored, there's forest. And then used the color themselves to look at the numbers of species that occur there. And when we do that for the state of Rio de Janeiro, we see that the greatest number of threatened species are just to the east of where you are now, in these lowland areas that have isolated patches of forest. We know from the work of Tom Lovejoy in Manaus, just north of Manaus. 40 years ago, Tom established an incredible experiment of looking at patches of forest of different sizes. And we know from the work of Gonçalo Farage, who was my PhD student, that these forests, here's an image of the forests, satellite image. You can see there are different patches of forests, 1 hectare, 10 hectares, 100 hectares. Reserva Duque is 10,000 hectares. That we've got forests of different sizes, and we can follow the loss of species from these fragments. Small fragments lose more species, and they lose them more quickly. If we combine these together, this is a paper that Gonçalo and I did almost 20 years ago now. Combine them with other studies of forest fragmentation. What you can see is that if you only have fragments of 1 or 10 hectares, you will lose a large fraction of your species within a decade. That you need to have fragments of 10,000 hectares if you're going to slow the rate of species loss down. Now, I cannot emphasize enough that this is a recipe for conservation action, that we need to reconnect the fragments in order to slow down species extinction.
Identify the places where the greatest number of species are at risk of extinction. And when we do that, we often find they're in very fragmented landscapes. They're not in large areas of continuous forest like the Amazon, but they're in the biodiversity hotspots, and those places have already lost a lot of their habitats. A good example of this is in the forest to the east of the city of Rio de Janeiro in coastal Brazil. This map shows the fragments and the number of threatened species that they contain. We have not just merely destroyed so much of the world's tropical forests. What we have left behind is in tatters, in fragments. Those fragments are often too small for species to maintain viable populations. There just aren't enough males to go around for the females and females to go around for the males. And of all the places, of all the fragments, one that I thought was particularly tragic was the one immediately behind me. This is the Union Biological Reserve in coastal Brazil, about 100 miles east of the city of Rio de Janeiro. Because in this isolated patch of forest are a whole load of species on the brink of extinction, the most charismatic of which is a beautiful little monkey called the golden lion tamarin. And the golden lion tamarins in that fragment could not go forth and multiply into the forest over there because there was the cattle pasture behind me. And when I saw that cattle pasture for the first time about 8 years ago, a cattle pasture just like the one I'm standing in, I thought it has to go. And so we have made it go away. This is a restored forest. I helped raise money for my friends at the Asociação Mica Leão Dourado, the Golden Lion Tamarin Association. I've planted this forest and it now connects that once isolated fragment of forest in the Union Biological Reserve to a much larger area of forest over in this direction. It's what we call a biological corridor. And it means that the golden lion tamarins that were once imprisoned in this forest island, this forest fragment behind me, can now cross through these small but growing trees and go and find new habitats, new homes, new places for their tamarin families.
So this is the area when Marie-Elise and I first visited it about 15 years ago. An open cattle pasture with a great deal of erosion. We decided we needed to do something about that. We needed to raise money to reforest that area. And so, 8 or 9 years later, that's what it looked like, and that's what it looks like now. It's now a very dense, restored forest where the cattle pasture used to be. And I think this is a remarkable conservation effort done with by helping our partners at the Asociação Mica Leão Dourado, because we've created this connection so that Reserva União is no longer an isolated island of forest. It was a patch of about 3,000 hectares. We know from the work we've done on forest fragmentation that was too small to support a lot of the species. It's now connected. The reserve itself has expanded to nearly 8,000 hectares, and it has continuous forest to connect to Tres Picos National Park. Well, for our next action, we saw that Poço dos Antes was isolated. And it was isolated not just by being an isolated patch of forest, but it was isolated by the fact that there was no way for species to cross BR101. So as this set of slides indicates, we needed to do two things. First of all, we needed to raise money to buy the property on the north side of BR101. But then having done that, we needed to create a habitat bridge. And so Luis Paulo of the Associación worked with the road company to get a bridge built. And as of just a week ago, we got this remarkable image. It's not the greatest camera trap photograph I've ever seen, but it's certainly one that I think is enormously exciting. It's of a species that we call the crab-eating fox in English, Circa cyan. And here it is. This is a video which is on their website, and you can see a little family of these foxes crossing. So Poço dos Andes is no longer an isolated forest fragment. So I just love this photograph. It's in the early days of the restoration effort at Fazenda Dourada, the property that connects Reserva União to the forests. Here are a lot of school children who are helping with the planting. And so we have reconnected these fragments. We've got several projects in Brazil. We've got Fazenda Dourada, this project, which is now complete. We've got the project across BR101, Fazenda Igarapé. And then I'm working extensively now with Nicholas Locke at Hegua to work with him and his group to reconnect a lot of the forest fragments in the watershed that's to the west of where the tamarins are, but where there are a lot of species, including tapirs. Nicholas has been successful at reintroducing tapirs to Rio de Janeiro state. So 30%, it's a great idea. But remember, it's not necessary to protect 30% or even 50% in order to save a lot of biodiversity. We can save biodiversity if we are smart, if we use our science. But equally, it's not sufficient. We need to protect a lot more of the Amazon. And it begs a lot of details. Where do we put our protected areas? They need to be in the right place. Broadly, we're doing that, but we need to do more of it. And finally, you know, the total area that my group Saving Nature has helped protect is really quite small. But by building these corridors, and we now have a dozen of these habitat corridors in Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, Sumatra, Tanzania, we're building a lot of corridors around the world. And by doing that, we're connecting the habitats that we have in a way that makes it possible for species to survive. So, thank you very much.
Stuart, thank you so much for your excellent talk. It will show very well the broad aspects of conservation, and also how important it is to have good scientific work to have effective actions towards conservation.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, one of the things I'd like to interrupt you on, Maria-Luise, it's not just good science. A lot of this science comes out of Brazil. I mean, the Forest Fragmentation Project, which has been a major effort in Brazil, is a driving force behind these studies, and we're thrilled to have been working with our partners, with the Mykolean people and Nicholas, You know, this is exciting stuff, and it's coming out of Brazil.
Yes, and we thank you so much for that, because this has been very important for protecting the Mata Atlântica, Atlantic forest, that, you know, are really in a very, very hard conditions nowadays, as we showed us, and we know very well. So we are ready for questions. I think, Rodrigo, we have already a question from YouTube, is that right?
Yes, we have a question from Mariana. I wrote here in the chat. Can you see?
Let me bring the chat box up. Now I've stopped sharing my screen. I can see.
I haven't seen yet, Rodrigo.
Okay. I will send it to you then.
Please. It's from Mariana Vale?
No, Mariana Ferreira.
Ferreira. Mariana Ferreira asks you, Stuart,
I see
when
it.
you say...
I've got it, Mario. I've got it.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, all we're saying in this, Mariana, is that these species are, that parts of their range are protected, okay? Now, you might say, well, does that mean a lot of their range is protected or a little bit of the range is protected? We're just looking at the numbers. So it's only a first order estimate. As you say, it's about the presence. It's not the long-term viability. That would be a yet another kind of analysis. But I do think it's indicative of the fact that we are putting our protected areas in the right places. You know, Reserva União, Poço dos Santos, they're in the right places. Now, are they viable? No, they're not viable because we need to build corridors. So the analysis is a first step, not a final solution.
People here in the Zoom, you can open the microphones and the audios, and you can ask straight your questions to Stuart. This is a time now for interaction.
Okay, I've just seen a question about freshwater ecosystems. I mean, I didn't talk about freshwater. It's absolutely the same problem that we need to reconnect. We need to reconnect freshwater systems too. I can't emphasize enough how important that is for the watersheds that serve the city of Rio de Janeiro and the species that occur within them. We need to, you know, we need to reconnect the aquatic systems every bit as much as the terrestrial ones.
Thomas, do you want to ask?
Oi, Thomas.
Hi, Stuart. Oi.
Nice to
Hi,
see
Stuart. It's wonderful to see you again in silico. I want to, yeah, in person would be better. I'm old enough to prefer personal contact, but anyway, I want to take you back, maybe a bit sideways. And this talk was excellent, and I think what people are doing in Rio de Janeiro, which is my native state, is truly remarkable. Still, I have a concern which takes me back 30 years when I saw a talk in Silwood. We may have attended this together when Dick Wainwright gave a talk on prioritization of areas, the first analysis that he was doing with Paul Williams, I think. And so at that time, what they were doing was looking at distributions of milkweed butterflies and bees, if I remember right, and picking areas which would have the highest concentrations of endemic species and where we should concentrate conservation efforts. Now, here's the question. At that time, I was seriously disturbed when he showed maps of the Amazon, because he showed, in that talk, he showed us that if we conserve the right 10% of the Amazon, we would be conserving the majority of bumblebee species or something.
Yep.
And I looked at this in reverse. I looked at that map and I thought, he's just giving the authorities license to devastate the other 90%. So this is the question I want to put to you. Whatever figure we're talking about, 50%, 30%, isn't it equally important to emphasize that this is not to say that if we conserve these X%, we're free to destroy everything around them or outside them? That whatever's happening in the wider landscape. I know this is, I'm just prodding you. I know we're doing
no, but it's a vitally important question, Tom, and I totally understand where you're coming from on this. So notice when I talk about the Amazon, I don't say, you know, we need to protect 90% of the Amazon to protect all of its species. We don't. We need to protect most of the Amazon because we will lose the Amazon as a functioning ecosystem if we don't protect it, right? But rather than get involved in sort of semantic arguments, let's look at where Brazil's threatened species are concentrated. And to a first approximation, that's the Mata Atlantica, and to a second approximation, it's the state of Rio de Janeiro. So you are in the middle of the priority. And that's the reason that I turned up on Fred and Maria Luisa's daughter in 1989 and said, hey, I'm me. You have no idea who I am, but I'm here and I want to do conservation. And they said, who the hell are you? And Tim Moulton said, well, you know, he does food webs. That's probably a slight, you know, contraction of the full story. But I came to work there with you. It's been a great honor because you're in the middle of the most important place. So given that, we have to worry about what's happening in your state and your part of Brazil. What are the actions that we can take? And I think, you know, we don't need to be too distracted by too many academic arguments. We want to use our science, but we want to use it in sensible, practical ways. So yeah, I think these sort of studies of which 10% can we protect are sort of interesting academically, but they're not that important because that's not the decision that's being made. I mean, the decisions that's being made in coastal Brazil is which pieces of land can we buy and which pieces of land can we connect. And that, I think, is something where our science can play a major role.
Can I just protest very quickly? If Maria Alice and Fred, when you first turned up in Rio, said, who are you? That means that I'm a total failure as a teacher because they had read Pimm in graduate classes with me in Campinas before you turned up. So I hope that didn't happen.
It didn't happen. It didn't happen. But it was, I mean, there was an element of, yes, we know who you are, but why are you here? And there were some interesting discussions about that. But you know, I've been coming back now for more than 30 years. And I miss being with you. I mean, I really wish I was giving this talk at OERJ rather than from my living room.
He would be here personally to do this talk because he comes every year or every 2 years, Thomas, but this time we couldn't manage that. So I miss him a lot. So I said, Stuart, let's do that remotely.
Yeah, I mean, this is the longest time I've been away. I mean, looking at Frej and Nena and Tim and Marie-Lise and the rest of you, I'm feeling very homesick. I mean, you are my Brazilian home.
And we miss you a lot.
Thank you.
So more questions. Thank you so much, Thomas, to join us. Would it be possible, perhaps personally, on the other way of doing?
Okay, so Tim's got his hand up and Fred's got his hand up.
Fred, and Tim.
Fred and Tim.
Hi, Stuart. How are you?
I'm very well. Nice. It's good to see you both.
Yes, very nice to see you, Stuart. I will put on the chat the question, and I would like to you, if you possible, you comment on that.
Okay.
Okay.
Fred, if you prefer, you can say it.
Yeah, Fred, just ask it.
You can do it personally.
You have shown how fastly we are losing species on Earth. And on this subject is also very concerning. The losses involving not so conspicuous loss of species as our parasites. Although they are a huge portion of Earth biodiversity, the demonstrations about the studies for protection of parasites, inclusion in lists of threatened species are not common. And we have a lot of species that are now not under protection. And so I would like to hear you about the parasites, such very important species to control many other populations of the planet.
I mean, I think that I totally understand the concern. I also understand the broader concern. I mean, we are making decisions. I mean, by this, you know, at Saving Nature, we are making decisions about which properties we want to help our Brazilian partners buy. The Mycolean people, Nicholas Locke at Hegua, we are making these decisions on which pieces of property we're going to try and buy from local landowners. And we're making those decisions on the basis of birds and mammals and amphibians, and mostly birds. We're not making the decision in terms of plants because we don't know where they are in any detail, and we're not making any decisions about priorities from parasites, which are a very large group of species, or insects, or anything else. This is a view of the world that and no fish either. We're doing terrestrial ecosystems, and they're strongly biased by birds. And I'm really aware of that. But you know, the problem is just exactly what are we going to do? And one argument says that it probably doesn't matter, that if we you know, if you look at Fazenda Dourada, the first project that we did, that has connected Reserva União to Tres Picos. That's probably good for everything. It's good for birds, it's good for mammals, it's good for butterflies, it's probably good for parasites too. Do we know that? No, but it's probably a good guess, Fred, that what we've done there is good for a lot of different species. The question is, if we knew more about parasites and butterflies and other species, would we do things differently? And that, I think, is a very good, you know, that is a good point. And we do need to have better taxonomic surveys so that we don't put our efforts in the wrong places. I mean, a few years ago, I did a paper on the distribution of orchids in the Mata Atlântica. It's an incredibly rich area for orchids. And, you know, I was imposed upon to study orchids because my elder daughter, who I remember bringing as a teenager to Rio de Janeiro, is now a professor of orchid systematics. And she said, Dad, why aren't you looking at orchids? You know, are we putting our efforts into places that are good for orchids? And I don't know. And the answer may be no, because orchids have sort of different elevational requirements. So I think the thing is, we've got to use what knowledge we have to do the best job that we can, and to try and learn more about the parasites that you bring up, fish, other taxa, to see if we ought to be doing things differently. It's a very difficult choice. Now, did that answer your question, mate?
Yes, thank you. I like your comment. Thank you.
Super. Tim, I know you had a question. Are you next?
Well, I had a question, but I've now got to answer you on orchids, because that original paper that you gave at the meeting in Florida sparked the interest of my wife, Maria do Rosario, to then take this question to REGWA and study the question at REGWA. And of course, we produced a small paper on the importance of that altitudinal gradient. And then we're able to cross that with the hotspot question, which immediately brings up the fact that the most endangered orchids are not in the ultra-rich places, but they're on your plain, on that the plain forests and all the rest, and the distribution at Ilha Grande is different again. But yes, we've addressed that, and internationally, Rosario works with a group that is based in San Diego and in California, that are doing exactly this thing of looking for hotspots of orchid diversity in places where you can buy the land and control it and all the rest. And so that's working very well at a small scale, the small scale that amateurs can apply, people of goodwill to orchid conservation. My question was sort of continuing from Thomas's worry about looking at the Amazon and saying, well, if we give priority to bumblebees, this will give all of the area with lower species diversity free slather for the developers. My general question is that, okay, we have areas of high species diversity, and it's nice to be able to apply efforts to that. But if we only use species diversity as a criterion, we're leaving out whole areas of the Cerrado and the Caatinga and places like that. I know that certain scientists working in the Cerrado and Caatinga and places like that get rather irritated with the scientists of the Mata Atlântica and saying, yeah, you guys have got all the trees and the high species diversity, but look at what's happening to our ecosystems. So I'm sure you agree that we need an ecosystem-based perspective on this as well, so that we don't we don't give short shift to the important systems that just so happen not to have high species diversity.
No, I agree. I mean, that's why I started out by saying, look, we need to protect a very large fraction of the Amazon simply because of the ecosystem processes that depend on protecting a large area. I'm very sensitive to the need to protect the Caatinga, to protect the Cerrado. You know, those are ecosystems which are underrepresented. At Saving Nature, we are not, you know, we don't just protect forests, tropical forests. We're looking for any habitat that we can, you know, we can reconnect and reestablish. It's much harder in some places than others. The problem with the Cerrado is that the value of the land is so high because of farming. It's harder to work out practical solutions there. But yes, we need to protect more habitats, and we need to reconnect more habitats across a wide variety of different places.
We have some questions from YouTube, and can you have a look at the chat, please? At least 3 questions I see here. Daniela, Matias.
I only see, oh, Daniela. Oh, hi, Danny. Yes. So the question is, you know, how do we address the people issue? One of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about is that people outside of Brazil often think that the Amazon is completely devoid of people. They think that there's nobody living in the Amazon. And in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. The areas that are protected in the Amazon are indigenous reserves. And looking after those people and respecting their rights is a vitally significant piece of the conservation puzzle. We need to recognize that some of the actions, I mean, some of the things that your president has said about destroying the Amazon and destroying the people within it are totally repugnant to many of us, I'm sure all of us here. So yes, people matter. Now, in terms of what we do at Saving Nature, we used to call ourselves Saving Species, and we now call ourselves Saving Nature because we wanted a more broadly based recognition of what we do. And we are very much involved in working with local conservation groups because they generally do a very good job of respecting local people. Now, I could get quite cross about my least favorite large conservation group, which was supposed to do things in the Mata Atlântica. It came and visited with a very famous film star who visited the headquarters of the Golden Lion Tamarind people at that time. And Luis Paulo has a picture of him holding up a Golden Lion Tamarind t-shirt. And I said, well, how much money did this organization give you? And he said, they didn't give us any money at all. And I said, well, at least this chap bought a t-shirt. And he said, no, Harrison didn't even buy the t-shirt. So many big organizations don't do anything for the local communities. What we're able to help with in Brazil is because of the tree planting to help local families, you know, find the seeds, grow the trees, and empower local people. And we're very, very much involved in doing that in all the projects we do worldwide. So I think it's very, very much important for conservation to be run by people in the local community and to engage local people so that they are part of this conservation effort.
Stuart, there is another question of Mariana Ferreira here. Can you see in the chat? I just dropped it there. About conservation areas in land and what can be used for marine protected areas.
Yes, I think one of the things one of the really quite dramatic changes in conservation over the last decade has been the expansion of marine protected areas. I served on a number of international committees on marine protected areas 20 years ago. It was an idea that was very controversial back then. I think we're recognizing that we need to protect a lot more of the ocean. We need to set aside areas that are not overfished. We need to set up no-take zones. Connecting those areas is going to be much more difficult in the ocean. But nonetheless, I do think it's that the general principles are quite clear. We need to you know, we need to establish networks of protected areas so that the species populations are viable.
Thank you. There is another question, Rodrigo, of Matias. Is that right, from YouTube?
Yes, we have.
I don't see that.
Don't you see that? Rodrigo,
I can read here. Yeah.
Can you?
Go ahead, Rodrigo.
Okay.
copy it there, please.
Professor Pimm, I agree buying land and establishing reserves can be more effective than waiting for the government to do it. But do you think this can relieve the authorities from their responsibility?
Oh, absolutely not. We need to get the authorities to set aside more protected areas, and we need to get them to respect the protected areas that have been set aside. But for all sorts of reasons, those protected areas may not be viable. And you know, the two examples I showed you of União being isolated, 2,700 hectares. I forget what the area of Poço dos Antes is. It's about 3,000 hectares or something like that. So the government sets aside those reserves. And we should encourage that, but they're isolated. And so what we've been able to do, working with, you know, with our private sector Brazilian partners, with now Luis Paulo and Nicholas Locke, is to go beyond what the government has done and make those reserves more practical. So yes. We need to engage the government. We need to say, what are you doing to protect more land? But there's a lot of things that we can do beyond that.
And it's good to add, Stuart, that these actions at União also had all these people involved, that, as you said, but also helped a lot this action for expanding the area 3 times more of this reserve. And this is very important.
I mean, we involved, you know, our partners at União from the very, very beginning. The way that the project worked is that, you know, Clinton and I looked at this area and said, look, you know, how much is it going to, I mean, the basic history is that we were at, we were at a meeting set up by Conservation International. You probably gather I am a critic of them, to look at conservation priorities in coastal Brazil. And it was a fantastic meeting. There were thousands of liters of caipirinhas consumed, and it produced a map that we thought was completely worthless. And the meeting cost, I don't know, $200,000. And we thought, you know, for that price, we can do some really practical conservation. So we went out and we looked at that area and said, you know, what's it going to take to buy that area? And the answer was about 350,000. So we worked with Denise Hembaldi to make that purchase. And the moment that we made the purchase, the land which we made with them, the land immediately went to the federal government. So the reserve managers at União were very much part of that process. And so having connected União through Fazenda Dourada, they then got conservation easements. And I think that whole area now is 9,000 hectares. So yeah, we need the government involved in this, and I think that was a project that I found very satisfactory because of the way all those pieces came together.
That's very true, and you shown very well this corridor on the BR 101, and the species already crossing. And we are waiting for the Nicoleões to do that. Isn't that true?
I think there will be a lot of celebration if we get the Micos to cross that bridge.
That's true. So we have to be back here for a beer. So people, we have still a few minutes to go. And if you still want to do a question, please do so.
If we have time, I want to ask you a question, Stuart.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Your talk was very, very good, very interesting. And you work a lot with practical actions. So I think that's very good. But sometimes we have some conflict when we have the best science available showing these are the most biodiverse regions, for example. And sometimes in these regions, we have a lot of economic activities and a lot of interest from companies and etc. So what would you say we can do from the lessons you learn and tips you can suggest, how we can convince stakeholders when we have this conflict and when we have really biodiverse regions in places where we have human activities, economic development?
Well, I mean, I think the point about the paper that I talked about how to, how to protect half Earth, is that we should congratulate ourselves. I mean, Rio de Janeiro state is an area where land prices are quite high, where there's a lot of development. There's increasingly that we worry about people moving from the city out into the countryside and buying small fazendas. So this is not, a particularly easy place to work, but we nonetheless can use our science to be as strategic as we possibly can. And saving nature, we haven't helped our partners buy a lot of land, but we've helped our partners buy land in the right places. I mean, altogether, we've probably raised $3 million for land purchases in Rio de Janeiro state. But we've got an awful lot of money. We've got an awful lot of biodiversity for that money. So I think the important thing is we don't have a lot of money, but we need to be smart. We need to use our science to the best effect.
Thank you.
That's true, Stuart. As you said, it's not a lot of money, but on the right places and from our knowledge in terms of have the science fundamentation. This is very important. So people, we are just about to finish. We still have opportunity for another question here if you want.
Stuart, hi, how are you?
I'm very well, my love. How are you?
Fine. Just for record, I saw the video of the crab-eaten fox yesterday, and it was a very good surprise. You know why? Because the crab-eaten fox is one of the most run-over mammals in Brazil. And in areas with tunnels, it doesn't cross it. So the bridge is working for this species, and this is very good. I'm very happy that it happened.
Yeah, no,
I
saw that. We were all enormously excited by that. And it's sort of a nice little group of foxes. So, yeah.
Yeah, just a record. Thank you for your talk. It was very good.
Wonderful.
Hope that you come to Brazil as soon as possible to visit us.
Me too.
So people, if you don't have more questions, I think we can finish. But before that, we'd like to have a picture with you, Stuart, for record.
Okay.
So
I will take the picture. No worries.
Okay, Israel.
Before I still open the cameras.
Yes, please, if you can.
Okay.
Braulio, que bom ter você aqui, Braulio.
Okay,
it's done.
Have you taken the picture?
Yeah,
I take the picture.
So you've got the picture. Okay, great.
Stuart, do you know Braulio Dias?
I just saw him. Yeah, there you are. Great to see you, Braulio.
Hi, Stuart. Great to hear your talk. Very great.
Thank you.
Just a comment. The COP15 for biodiversity was postponed until late April next year. So there's still a lot of time to discuss among ourselves what kind of proposals can be inserted into the negotiation. So just like to remind people about this possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited. I think the Chinese are going to be good hosts. I've seen their position paper. I think there are issues about how they can influence other people, and President Xi Jinping seems to be very committed on environmental issues. So I hope the next COP is going to be a very important one. I hope to be there, but that's we'll have to see. Okay.
One day by another. We have to think about that all the time now. The thing is, we keep going. Thank you so much, Stuart, for
great
this
to see you all.
talk and for this time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Wonderful
Stuart.
talk. Thanks a lot.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Foi muito bom te ver também aqui. Tchau.